Hi guys, my name's Tom Pickering. Welcome to the pub. Delighted that you've managed to join us. The top level theme of this is actually bankers and jazz bands, which is no pun intended, but this is all about taking new action, recognising the current situation, and trying to make sense of that, but also really us working together from these calls to join forces to fix some of these problems. So that is really the focus. But I'm very, very grateful to the regular pub attendees who join us on a weekly basis and for their contribution to the work we've got going on in the background. So my credibility and my team's credibility is really around having led 200 company turnarounds and delivering immediate results and generating cash. And I think unique identifier in this current situation is those businesses that can generate cash. The thing about cash is it's uniquely bullshit free as well, to be quite honest. I mean, the amount of money you've got in the bank is a fact, and the business ability to generate cash is pretty clear. So the other aspect of this is our background is around uncertainty and an extreme challenge, which we foresaw quite some time ago, going back to March, and really concerned me, and hence created this pub, which, to be honest, is the last thing I wanted to do. Last thing I want to do is create a webinar, but I'm really pleased that we have, and we've stepped over the edge and done that ourselves. And this is about the 25th one of these. I'm really delighted to invite Paul Kempster to join us today. Paul is a guy who I regard very highly professionally, but also in a banking context. He's also somebody we've actually done some work with in retail turnaround at Barclays, and actually done quite a lot of work with Barclays over the years, either indirectly or directly through Paul's team. So delighted to have Paul joining us today. Alongside Paul, we've got David Allen. David comes to the US, and David McLean. And the idea is really to take as broad a perspective of this situation as possible, so we're not creating our own little echo chamber. So it's beautifully unscripted. So just to recap some of the aspects of what we've learned to date, I think the new now is really rediscovering a new reconnection between people and an intimacy. Intimacy is a bit of a strange word, which we'll discuss a bit more. Major buying shifts, reduction in consumption. I think there's a real focus on doing the right thing as well. So quite a few businesses getting caught out trying to cut corners. And it's also the link between profit and relationships as well. So woe betide any businesses that try to make money without much of a relationship. So I think there's a bit of a challenge to tech and other businesses, which we may touch on. And survival very much depends on taking new action. And I emphasize the word new, because a lot of organizations are either doing less or more of the same, which frankly is unlikely to succeed in this situation. So they're the headlines. So I'm delighted again that Paul's joining us. Welcome, Paul. Very much look forward to what you've got to say, and off you go. Over to you, my friend.
Great, thanks Tom, and good afternoon to everybody. Yeah, delighted to have had the chance to join you today. Tom, I think you've given me about 5 minutes, so this is going to be a bit quick fire in terms of a bit of a download and thoughts, and then hopefully stimulate some conversation and debate. First point is, Tom, I was very excited when you invited me to the pub on a Tuesday, because I haven't been to one for about 7 months, and then I found out it was Zoom. So, but anyway, you'll have to take me to the pub when we're allowed to see each other. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is just share a little bit of thought process and insight in terms of client business behaviour that myself and my teams have been seeing. A little bit of the last 4 months, 5 months, maybe a bit more focus on what we think is coming in Q4 and into 2021. And then importantly, what we would say is vital for businesses to really be doing around, and the way they go around things. Just before we get into that kind of client insights though, some stats. We all love a bit of stats, but they are important. So from a banking context, lending under government schemes. I'm sure we're all pretty familiar now with the mnemonics, SIBLs, syllables, bounce back loans, you know, to name but a few. But these are all schemes that didn't exist as recently as late March or April. So it's very recently come in. Now, from a UK banking market perspective, SIBLs, which is a real mainstay product, 46,000 loans have been granted for £10.5 billion. Bounce back loans, 1.04 million loans with a value of £32 billion has flowed out. And then in the larger business segment, syllables, the industry doesn't disclose those numbers because it gets a bit market sensitive, but I can assure you it's multi-billions in that area as well. So the key thing here is that this aggregate lending and liquidity injection that's gone into the markets from the banks backed by the government partially, it represents lending growth of about several years worth for most banks, okay? So it's absolutely unprecedented, never seen it before. It's all happened in basically 12 weeks. Now, if you overlay on top of that the other government support schemes, furlough, business rate reliefs, local grants, HMRC deferment, obviously the numbers balloon from there. So we all know that there's multi-billions that have flowed into business. The economic outlook, a couple of stats there. I'm certainly no economist, as Tom knows. If I did, I'd have a nice little Caribbean island somewhere, but I don't, so I'm not that clever. But I do take an interest in it. I think we all do. I was listening to and reading the Governor of the Bank of England's release last week, and no great surprise, but the numbers and the stats are quite eye-watering. 9 million UK workers furloughed. Unemployment is expected from the Bank of England to hit 8% by the year end. And there was indeed some employment stats out about an hour or two ago. GDP contraction, nearly 10% this year, with a predicted bounce back of positive growth of 9% in 2021. So i.e. just recovering ground, in essence. And base rates, well, can it get lower? Well, it could. It's at 10 basis points. Absolutely no sign of it going up for several years, according to the Bank of England. And it may go down. And Bailey was talking about not wanting to go to negative rates, but we might see a compression. It might go down to 5 basis points or 0. So, and all of those forecasts were built on the assumption of no significant second COVID spike and with as orderly, smooth transition into Brexit as we possibly can. Okay, so that's the framework. That's what's dominating the bank's thinking. It's dominating certainly the clients that we speak to in terms of what they're doing. So what have they been doing? What have we observed? Well, the last 4 months, the immediate focus, I guess, as we all had the shell shock effect, coming back to Tom's point, it's all about cash. So it's all about preserving and storing, and I'd emphasize the word storing, liquidity. And the point here is that whilst the loan schemes have all launched and funding has dropped in, by no means have businesses burnt through that cash. In fact, they are preserving cash. And I guess it's the kind of the sentiment of fear that is making sure that they're doing everything they can to preserve liquidity, not just for the 4 months they've been through, but for what's coming. So we've seen record growth in deposits that have been coming in to the bank's balance sheet, possibly a flight to safety and quality amongst the big banks, I suspect, which normally happens in these times. But it's outstripped every business plan we had in terms of lending growth and deposit growth. So it's quite an interesting conundrum there. We've also seen businesses and clients move to immediate changes to operating models. Now, some obviously were forced to cease trading, hotels as an example, but others where they could trade but couldn't trade physically moved super fast where they could to online and digital trading even more than ever. And one client's quote struck me when I spoke to them a few weeks ago, and they said their management team and their board of an owner-managed business have accelerated their adoption and mindset around digital trading by 5 years in the space of 5 weeks. So that was quite compelling, I think, in terms of their mindset. And everyone has been thinking about their mid-term cost base looking forward. So beyond the liquidity crisis, thinking about that cost base. So that was the quick look back, the sentiment. If we look forward to Q4 this year particularly and into 2021, again, no rocket science, but this is what the clients are saying to us. They are now very focused on how do they cope, how do they survive when this drug of liquidity support is withdrawn. So, they are going to face the end of furlough, the end of civils schemes, the need to catch up on HMRC deferment, business rates, holidays, all of that's going to come. So they're very much looking at, right, what's the new liquidity control as they move through that period. They may also be facing working capital changes. So we're seeing behaviour from creditors with terms of trade changing, and indeed debtors who are trying to stretch their own liquidity as well. So, some clients may be having a pinch point on working capital funding as well. And then just to help us, we have a few other things. Secondary Crown preference. That's nice. That's coming in, or likely to come in December. And, whilst that's a insolvency recovery matter, it's not really. It's actually, what about those businesses that currently have working capital facilities structured against debtors and debentures? All of that's going to have to change. That may be a liquidity squeeze further for them as well. And we won't talk about Brexit. I certainly won't talk about it, but all I'll say is it's out there, and that's got to be navigated as well. So quite a heady mix as we go into Q4 and into 2021. But if I wrap up, because I'm conscious of time, what's the overall focus? What's the most important thing, aside from all those things that we do understand? It is about keeping a very calm head. It is about having the right team in place. So we are talking to our clients all the time about what's your team, who's on the pitch. Now, some clients get it quicker than others, because the ones that get it realise you're not talking just about the management team, you're talking about the support network around them. Who are the advisors? Who can bring the experience to what's coming? Because most businesses have never seen this before, okay? And you need the plan B and you need the plan C, and you need to take external insight and counsel around these things. So we're very much advocating that to our clients. We're pushing and testing them around their plans. We want to know what the downside plans look like. And that links to the next big piece and big focus, which is no surprises. Open communication, transparent communication with funders. As Tom knows better than me, the biggest, for a bank this is, the biggest inhibitor to a successful turnaround is when we get surprised and funders get surprised. So we'd rather have the ugly truth a long time in advance, with the ability to all sit around and decide what it is we can do, because typically there is something you can do. But if you have no time, there's nothing you can do. And it also leads to a loss of management integrity, which is very damaging from a relationship perspective. So that's certainly the key theme that we've been peddling. I know when I speak to my colleagues and counterparts in other banks, they're very similar. So, I'll take the liberty of speaking on behalf of the banking industry, if I may. And I think that's very much sensibly where we go. And final thing from me is in the invitation to this, you may have picked up on the quote, which is, no one is incentivized to see a business fail. And I stand by that from a banking perspective. Maybe some IPs might disagree, but I stand by it from a banking perspective. We are not in the game of wanting business failure. We're going to face some, but now is not the time to try and sell assets. Now is not the time to try and sort of exit from a secondary route, because typically we'll end up with obviously job losses and recoveries and then being burnt. So we're realistic, but we're very much focused on what can we do to preserve business through 2021 and get through this storm, rather than just see it fall over. So it's just a few kind of sound bites and insight from me, I think, Tom. I hope it's helpful, but obviously I'm very happy to take any questions as we go along.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that's very clear, Paul, and very pragmatic. Question, I think, is the level of awareness. So when I look at some of the actions that have been taken at a business level, Paul, in terms of actually protecting the downside, as opposed to expecting an upside in businesses to protect them sort of through this patch. The best people I've seen are people who are holding back, have taken out the loans for the very, very rainy day, because that loan can kill your balance sheet, as everybody knows. If you start drawing it down without any sign of it, the cash position improving. But I mean, how do you see the gap between people's executive team skills and the awareness of this type of situation, the sort of actions they should be taking to mitigate the downside, as opposed to sort of just doing less or more of the same?
It's a great question. I mean, inevitably the answer is different depending on which clients you look at, and even potentially different segments of clients and industries. So, typically, no great surprise, our larger corporates are pretty well seasoned, very well advised, we're very well structured. Boards have got good experience and journeys behind them. It doesn't mean they'll get it right, but, they're typically in a place where they should be able to respond proactively. In the SME space, I think it can be very varied. It depends if it's a first, second, third generation business, what kind of war stories have been passed down. And then it comes back to the point I was mentioning earlier, which is the open-mindedness, the mindset of management to accept that they might not have the right answers. And the differential is the ones that think they can solve it all themselves and not look outside, versus those management teams at owner manager level that are prepared to listen and to reach out and to learn something new to get them through this phase.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. So Yeah, that's very clear. I think rather than asking a question, I'll chip in with some of my thoughts and observations, Paul, and maybe you come back to me with a couple of questions afterwards. So I think our observation is that when I look at what's happening, I think the leaders are really struggling to cope. I think there's an element of what I describe as being sort of post-traumatic stress disorder of some variety in leadership teams. And you know, even at its simplest level, there used to be a time when board dinners used to look like a luxury, but actually I think are becoming more critical because relationships between boards, and also relationships between people like yourselves, you know, to keeping the dialogue open has become increasingly critical. I think I'd like to use the example of McLaren as well, which is a public example, but I think it reflects, it's a local business to me as well, but it reflects a business that is pretty typical actually of what we're finding in terms of actions being taken. So they have burned through 290 million since the beginning of March, and actually you've got to ask the question whether or not people really do want McLarens moving forwards, because it very much flies in the face of the new now in the exorbitant consumption and the rest of it, and whether or not it's actually, you know, that the assets are actually helpful of all these vehicles and the historic vehicles and the rest of it, and whether or not they actually form part of the new now, whether or not you should leverage that, and actually what does that core business look like, and actually really to cut it back to a defendable core, which simply has not happened. And I think one of the challenges we've picked up, and going back to the legacy of that business, it's absolutely driven by pride, and pride is one of the things which prevents us from looking at situations in an open and frank way. And you know, some amazing characters, people like Ron Dennis, with pride coming out their ears, ability to come out their ears. But again, when things get tough, that can be shown up as being a weakness, because it shows a lack of advice. And you can see that in terms of the actions they're potentially taking in terms of a fundamental shift in their business. So I think that's one thing I'd say. In terms of the solution on the positive side, I think the analogy I'd like to draw, going back to the jazz band and banking theme, is what does a jazz band look like? An improvising jazz band doesn't have any music, right? It listens to customers, it responds and adjusts accordingly to what the customers actually, the way they feel. It's very intuitive, but it's all based on very close relationships. They have no predefined script, and actions are taken in real time. And they're very, very customer centric. And I think that then goes beyond the business or the jazz band to the customers, and also the suppliers and bankers and goodness knows who else are dependent on their well-being. And so I think that's really the sort of a metaphor that I think is helpful in terms of what does good look like. But that's very much the antithesis of where we've come from, which is long-term plans, you know, long-term cash flow and the rest of it. And I think it's very much more a question of getting the business model to lean and mean so it can cope with the bumps and the bangs, getting rid of a lot of the excessive stuff and of the past and putting that to one side to really weather this storm. So I think that comes down not to doing more or less, but actually something different. And this is about new action. So I think, why isn't this happening? I think the first thing is around, we don't see it. So this is what I describe as being blind spots. And so one of the challenges here is growth. And growth is so embedded. Everyone's talking about growth, growing out of this, but actually it's part of the problem. And actually it was only really invented in the 1970s. And the antithesis of that, a different paradigm, is gratitude. In other words, being more comfortable with a smaller, maybe more profitable business with less revenue, for example. And the paradigm is also about what's in it for me versus what's in it for you. You know, very much more community focus coming out of this that we should recognise. There's something else where I describe as being a bullshit farm, which I think is not intended to be disrespectful, but relatively accurate. So people are talking about ethical AI, and actually there's nothing ethical about AI. So just a very statement like that creates a whole dynamic which can be quite it sort of redefines truth and makes it very difficult for people to talk about things. And I think technology as well can also, whilst it's recent, can also be part of the old past, even though it's recent old past, and that should be challenged as well. So I think EQ versus IQ, I've asked David McLean to respond to this, but it's really about fixing the right problem. So when you're talking about fixing the right problem, it's actually what's driving us. How do we get to where we've got to? What mistakes have we made, and being aware of that. So that's really where the EQ comes from. The IQ is actually our ability to fix the problem, having actually identified what the problem is. So I think the real answer to this is actually to take new action. The difficulty with this is that leadership teams are a bit battered, I think, and they've got some tough choices. So there's some. China are becoming quite active in terms of investing. It's quite tempting to go for short-term money. I think as well we've got to be proud enough, humble enough, I should say, to overcome our pride to admit we've got things wrong. I think as well, it's all very well remote working, but I think relationships are potentially becoming more fragile by not getting closer to each other. And I think there's some short-term actions. I see the debt that you just described, years of debt, has been a massive misaligned action, which has been part of the old past. It's another mantra, which has been very generous. It's provided time, but nonetheless, it's misaligned in terms of getting businesses back to generate cash. So I think quite a few businesses are left selling the same old stuff. And expecting the world to move in their direction. And there's some big organisations like IBM and others who've got massive critical mass, but the question is, how much legs has that type of strategy got? So I think I mentioned as well, it's about creating a business model that can handle the downside, and that's a very lean, mean machine. When we actually get to a proper turnaround, it's very much the core business. In other words, what's difficult to replicate. And avoiding things like asset-based lending, because the dynamic of asset-based lending, the declining market, is a rapid cash drop-off. As we, it's great for growing to a degree, but for a finite period of time. But it's not something that is weatherproof in a decline. So it's that type of experience which I think is very difficult. I think the reality as well is also approachability. So how approachable are you, Paul? How approachable am I? Are people actually going to tell us the bad news? Are they actually going to say, look, I need some help? And in a lot of situations, I think that can be a job's worth situation, and quite difficult to put your hand up. So I think that's where I come back to do the full circle to the jazz band around intimate relationships, an environment whereby people can actually put their hand up and talk about very difficult things. And I think one of our observations over the last few weeks in terms of setting up various different pilots is it's remarkably difficult to do that. So there are some very difficult things to talk about, which we're not talking about, frankly. So, there's been a couple of conversations where some of the pilots we've set up have actually taken short-term actions to cash, which have actually obfuscated actually fixing the right problem, which is very tempting. But, this is the challenge in terms of integrity. And I think there's quite a few business models with very good leadership teams who have not planned for the downside, and or they have a financing structure which is leaving them very vulnerable. So, anyway, so I think the other side of this as well, in terms of remote working, it concerned me actually. But I thought, given the fact that if people aren't coping too well at the moment, if you've got to deliver a really bad message or a difficult message, maybe mass redundancy to people, you don't quite know how people are, right? And so it could well be that someone is putting a brave face on it, but could be quite depressed. And actually, by delivering some bad news without having some fallback position, could actually have catastrophic effects on that individual. And I think we have to be very careful of being able to deliver bad news, because I think there's actually what we need. I think the test of a relationship is when things are difficult, not when things are easy. And I think there's been a sort of utopian working thing that's been taking place. So anyway, cutting to the chase, what do we do about this? We actually run a one-day session basically to shine a light to get this jazz band working. So we encourage people to take different perspectives, and from these different perspectives, take different actions, and they're their own actions. And what that does is it enables a team to do this themselves, because I and the rest of my team have no interest in hanging around for any longer than we need to. And from that point, they can then generate their own cash and generate their own new actions. The critical thing, I think, is around new actions. And I'll give you an example of just how difficult some of this dialogue is. So, if you just take some of the recent dialogue, just consider LinkedIn, right? And I intentionally send stuff out on LinkedIn, but who has got the confidence to say the truth that all lives matter, right, on your LinkedIn profile? Now, the reason why I'm raising that is because that's just a true statement, okay? But actually, given the backdrop and the tyranny of tolerance that various different things have created, it's created a blind spot. And that's the nature of some of these discussions. And so there's a really fundamental discussion around leadership capability that I'm having with a number of partners. And I'm not saying we have the utopian answer to this, but we have got quite a large chunk of it. But at the same time, who's actually willing to admit that we haven't got the leadership skills internally between us to do this, and actually how are we going to develop that, and how are we going to work together to deliver. And these discussions are very difficult, Paul, and that's what we're finding. And I think it all comes back to relationships, and really, developing relationships which are open, free, very respectful, absolutely focused on doing the right thing without taking any sort of shortcuts. So that, I think, is what I'd contribute to this. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Paul.
Just briefly, yeah, because I appreciate there'll be some other topics you want to cover. But totally agree. Relationships are key, and I know it can sound trite to say it, but it really is. And I totally agree. The relationship is only really tested when things are strained or the conditions are tough, as opposed to the upside of doing a buyout in good times and everyone's popping champagne corks. So now I'm not going to speak for Barclays. I'll just speak more generally, and maybe this is professional services as well as banking. I think those businesses which have retained a relationship operating structure in their businesses, where there is person-on-person client marking that goes on, as opposed to a digital call center, as important as digitization is, I think that's where the value will come through. And we do find that businesses, even if they're reluctant to begin with, because of constant relationship contact, and it's coming from the right place, not with a big stick, it tends to get people to open up management teams. But without a relationship structure, operating structure in your business, I think that's a challenge. So I'd agree with you on that. Yeah. And the only other thing I would just very quickly pick up on is your earlier point around needing to get on with things and change things and take action and listen to the client, I think you said. So listen to the client. I'm definitely seeing that in terms of accelerating certain solutions and advancements. And if I think about Barclaycard business, which we're very close to, the acceleration in what was already planned in the H&L sector, as an example, for your integrated menus, don't need to see a waiter or waitress, obviously COVID-19 driven, but that acceleration in JVs has just taken off, and things are hitting the market probably a year or two before they should have done. Because clients are saying, I don't need you as a bank, I need your solutions to help my business model. And that's now starting to accelerate. So some very interesting things coming out there by listening to clients.
Yeah, fantastic. That's very interesting. Thank you very much, Paul. I think, so if anybody in the audience would like to ask any questions, please do so, fire them through. Just hand over to David Allen to contribute your bit, Dave. David, what do you think?
Sorry, I was on mute. I forgot. So, Paul, first of all, thank you for being here. It's great to have you here and get your perspective with Barclays. In terms of the new now, the things that I'm talking about heavily are paying attention to the work at the margin. So people have been forever just working on the, sort of within 1.5 standard deviations of whatever it is they do. And now you've got to move out of that. You've got to move completely. Just take the restaurant business. I said 1 year ago, if you're in a restaurant and they have a laminated menu, they're on the way to being out of business. And so all the things they were talking about, like, sticking that on your phone, on your tablet, whatever, but that's work at the margin that a year ago nobody thought about. And now, if you don't think about it, you're not going to be there. It's quite simple. So I look at sort of work at the margin in sort of 5 or 6 areas. First is the attention to the change in what your customer wants. And looking at that out at the margin, just not the easy, simple to use things, but really taking a look. The margin for error, where can I get it wrong? That's a huge, huge issue. And so the new now is going to be heavily focused on each of these areas. Now, you can't just pick out one thing or pick out another. You've got to be really good on all of these. You've got to be really, really good on performance. So we need to care about the whole EQ part of what people are doing. We need to care about their diet, their exercise, because the margin at performance is enormous. I was telling Tom 2 weeks ago that I live in Frimley in Surrey, little leafy Surrey village, and we have a big cricket team that plays every Sunday afternoon still. And but the difference between the people who play for Frimley, the batsmen who play for Frimley, the batsmen who bat for England, is probably only 1 or 2%. And you know, that is a huge issue, and that's affecting everywhere across the board, and also in areas like creativity and insights. And again, looking at the margin, and not just looking at the main part of it, but looking at the margin and what can we do, and how can we bring things in right now. I mean, not in the future. And you know, I can tell you that the U.S. is no better off than we are. We may be better off than the U.S. based on a bunch of different things. But and it was interesting here you cite those numbers about you know, the amount of lending that's been going on here, because they're having an equal amount of that lending in the U.S. Fed, and it's got to keep going. But again, it's all at the margin. So I think that the whole new now bit, I mean, that's exactly what you two are talking about, Paul. So, you know, I concur with it, and that's my little 2 cents. Tom?
Thanks, David. Yeah, brilliant. Great. So, David McLean, what are your thoughts from the people side of things?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Paul, for your thoughts. I've been really, really appreciated. So, yeah, you've also asked me to speak today, as you mentioned, Tom, just a little bit about EQ versus IQ, and actually, how many of the people on this call actually know what that is and really know what EQ really is. And there's different studies being done, and one that I'm particularly quoting, I'm going to quote here of the Carnegie Institute, is the EQ is responsible for 85% of business success. So if that's to be true, which I certainly believe it is, then we should really understand what emotional intelligence really, really is. IQ, we're all aware of that, and we're pretty much stuck, I'm guessing, with everybody on this call, particularly the age that we all are and above, that we're pretty much stuck, and it's a cognitive ability that we have. But in terms of emotional intelligence, it can very, very much to be developed, and it's developed in different ways, of course, and I'll talk a little bit about that just now. But so there's 5 stages really in terms of emotional intelligence, and if we can help ourselves as individuals here, everybody, if we can help ourselves, then ultimately this is going to be a better, or hopefully we'll get better results from it. So the first stage is self-awareness, and it's really the key point, actually. Alluding to Tom's point, do we have to swallow our own pride at that particular point or not? And there's a quote by Nietzsche, this German philosopher that I like, and there's a reason why most people walk blindly through life, because it's terrifying to pursue the alternative. So are you actually able to do self-awareness? Are you actually able to sit with the self-awareness or not? There's another quote as well, I like my philosophers, you can probably guess by Thoreau, and the masses of men live lives of quiet desperation. And I'll ask everybody on this call, have you ever lived, or are you living at the moment in quiet desperation? And if anyone tells me they're not, then they're lying, including me, is absolute nonsense. So it's really important to recognise this within yourself and be okay with not being okay. We've heard these sort of sayings before, but it's not about tree hugging, it's just about understanding who you are. Self-regulation, then once you start to understand who you are more and get help in that way, whatever that way may well be. Self-regulation, in other words, I'm going to do something about this in the context we're talking about. I'm going to get someone in to help or not, depending on what's going to happen in the business. And then the motivation, the desire, who am I, what am I supposed to be doing, what's the business, is this a business I want to run, do I want to reduce the size, actually now I've swallowed my pride and get to that point and actually have a more profitable business like Tom's talking about with a smaller one. And that's, those 3 stages are all the inner work that you basically have to do on your own or with other people, of course, but it's the personal changes. That then allows you to become that different person, have more empathy, more understanding, and of course better social skills, an ability to listen, to understand better, and to negotiate as well. Yeah, that's my points. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's really great. I think I'll just add a couple of points there. I think our performance is highly dependent on the people around us, I think, to keep us on the straight and narrow, to provide that healthy dialogue, to challenge us and keep the options open. Otherwise, we can become our own little echo chamber. I think that's part of the cause of the utopia that maybe we've created. But I think Yeah, and actually, I think what does good look like? I think it's almost like becoming. People talk about not accepting imposter syndrome. Actually, I think it's becoming comfortable with it to a degree, and/or being. I don't think we can become uncomfortable with certainty, but we can adopt a way of working that actually can accommodate taking immediate action. If you know what I mean, to this sort of jazz band type analogy. And I think the relationship side of this is critical to hold this thing together. But actually, when you do it, it's actually not that scary. But it's very scary not to do it. It's very scary not to be in a jazz band in this type of situation. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, David, or...
No, I definitely agree, yeah. I mean, the teamwork is absolutely everything, of course it is. But remember, it starts with the individual.
Yeah.
And the first point is that self-awareness.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter, and we can see that. It doesn't matter, Paul, again, you speak to people, and if they don't see it, they don't understand, and you're seeing it from the outside, and you think, my God, please make these decisions, will you? And they're just not doing it. So it really you need that self-awareness.
Yeah.
So you can
I think, yeah, and I think that's true. I think you need... Yeah, I think that said though, when you've got the self-awareness with a senior leader, it then becomes a team issue very quickly, because then you need to make it happen and give them the confidence to say, actually, it's okay not to know. Because I think most of the education systems, telling us that we have to know all the answers to all the questions, and Paul is expected to provide the finance or the financial advice to whatever. The expectations are, maybe unrealistic, and it's okay not to know, and not to be okay. I think that's a great place to be, but also be ourselves as well. We're always really fearful of not being ourselves, but again, I think these are things actually which are very positive out of this, that we can positive outcomes. Fantastic, thank you very much. So, have we got any questions, David?
We do, yes. We have 3 questions. First couple for Paul, and please anyone else ask questions as we go along. So Paul, this is from Richard Blakely. To what extent should we be worried that the forecast 2021 bounce back is based on assumptions, brackets no second wave or smooth Brexit, which are highly unlikely?
Blimey, I wish I knew the answer to that question. So it was Governor Bailey that's come up with those assumptions, and his team. I'll give you a personal perspective. I would be personally cautious, and to a degree, I wouldn't say worried. It's only a plan, it's only an assumption. We've already seen in the space of about 8 weeks, the Bank of England actually said the economy this year would contract by 15%, and that's now been revised down to 9.5% for this year. So for me, it's more in the timing. And I just read external reports, as I'm sure you all do as well. And I try and cut through the media noise and sensationalization of it all. And what I'm reading, I think, is indicating to me at least that, we're taking a pretty measured approach in this country and trying to control the virus. But if we bring it back to the business impacts, and I put it into our own, we're a business, the bank's a business. The bank had never, like any business, had been required in the space of 48 hours to move 140,000 people to home working, and to link up to 4,000 different internal systems that run a global bank. It had never been tested before. Did it all go brilliantly smoothly? No. But did the banking system stand up and respond to the government ask and deliver what was needed? Yes, it did. And now we've learned that you can actually work remotely pretty flipping successfully, even though the EQ side of it's very hard, because you do want to go out and see people. You really do. You miss that. But that would be my perspective around it. So I would say caution around it. I'm sure we'll have some blips and bumps along the way. But generally speaking, despite all of the headwinds, I'm actually cautiously optimistic, if that makes sense, because I think we've readied ourselves for it now. We know what we're doing in business.
Yeah, I'll just add one point to that, if I may. I think beware of averages, because an average is, some businesses will go up quite dramatically, others will come down. And by far the biggest, most difficult turnarounds are when you've got a loss-making business and a soft top line, hyper difficult. So that segment of the economy which is under pressure at the top line is very difficult to turn around.
Yeah, agreed.
Thanks, guys. The second one is for you as well, Paul, from Nick Brown. How will you handle the bad debts when they come in? 1, we just claim off the government. 2, sell the debts to debt collection agencies. 3, collect yourselves. 4, something else. What is your plan B for when the second, when, he's put down, perhaps brackets if, but yeah, when is the plan B, what is the plan B for when the second and third waves arrive?
Yeah, okay. So there's quite a few questions in there, isn't there, I think? And they're all good questions and fair questions. So you might have to repeat elements of it to me.
Sure.
And again, I can only speak from a personal and Barclays perspective. You'll understand that. So I can't speak for the policies of other lenders. But when it comes to recovering debt, if that sad day arrives, it's a bit more complex than it might appear on the face of it, because whilst a government-backed loan may have gone out, it's probably alongside pre-COVID credit facilities, which have different security structures around them, and the interaction between them and the government guarantees are quite complex and quite legal. It also is something that you can't just foreclose on in one day and recover your money the next day. It doesn't work that way. It's a very deep, technical and long time before banks will be able to get recovery from effectively the taxpayer and the government. So with that context in mind, park that almost for one moment. The normal approach applies, which is we always try and intervene early. We want to see early warning signs because, back to the point we discussed earlier, there's a better chance of turnaround and recovery and not some sort of awful insolvency. And we have very specialist teams that Tom knows that are very experienced in this market and working with companies around turnaround from a funder's perspective. So we always put all of our energy into that. Plan B and Plan C, of course, is always the downside of insolvency. And in doing that, again, the steps would be taken to try and mitigate it. Number one, if you can't, be to optimize the timing of it, because ultimately, you're looking for the best outcome of a bad situation. So that's kind of the policy around those. There was other elements of the question, though. Sorry, David.
Yeah, no, thank you. And what is your plan B for when the second and third waves arrive?
Okay, yeah, actually, there was another point in there about selling debts to debt collection agencies and the like. It's not something that Barclays do in the corporate marketplace. We have proprietary teams I've just talked about, specialists, and they're an extension of the relationship team. So not into kind of debt trading or anything like that in the recovery market. Plan B and Plan C is like all good businesses, I hope. We've been putting a lot of energy in, obviously dealing with the crisis ourselves, but our resiliency and contingency plans have been tested and redrawn. If something comes again, we know where we need to be with the technology bandwidth. We know where we need to be with our resources, our people, about the people with the skills, and if we know how to replicate those skills if, God forbid, some of the members of the team become unwell. So we've always had, because we're a highly regulated organisation as a bank by the PRA, the FCA, and obviously HM Treasury take close interest in us in ordinary times. We've always had to have downside contingency plans, not necessarily for COVID, but for all manner of disaster that might hit. They are regularly tested. So we go through kind of dry run testing all the time in the good times. And we have external audits in terms of our resiliency. What I would say is that stood us well. And we've now learned some stuff that we hadn't probably previously seen. And so, who knows? It depends what happens, but I think we're in a pretty resilient place, subject to something else coming along, if that answers the question.
Excellent. No, it really does. Thank you, Paul. So question for you, Tom, and anyone else that wants to answer on the panel. Tom, from Andrew Pepper. Debenhams has just announced mass redundancies in the last 20 minutes. Did you foresee this? Does this reinforce your views for the future on the new reality?
I don't know. I need to look at the detail of Debenhams. I think, am I surprised? No. It comes back to the core business. Debenhams' core business is the challenge, I think. What is difficult to replicate about Debenhams? I don't think there's much difficult to replicate about Debenhams. I think it probably should be a far smaller business, not selling anything like the range personally, but the challenge is how do you get from A to B with the capital structure and the overheads you've got. So I think probably my hypothesis, if I was looking at Debenhams, and I've looked at a few retailers, is that it's impossible to get from A to B. There may be a restructure to wipe pretty much the entirety of the business off the face of the earth and have a much smaller, much more focused business, but there's quite a lot of analysis to try and find out what that is, if it exists at all. But that's something I would spend a few days to try and investigate. The challenge with that, though, is a EQ problem, right? to try and understand the history of the business, the thinking that's enabled it to get to where it's got to, and then from that place, then conduct the financial analysis to figure out, what is the financial model? Can it stand on its own 2 feet in the new form? What are the margins likely to be? The pricing will always have to go up in that type of situation. Are the customers willing to pay? And test all of that in a very, very short space of time and launch it pretty much immediately. So I think capital structure is probably knackered, probably restructuring, probably a much smaller business. Big question mark as to whether or not the core business is defendable, Andrew.
Okay, thank you.
I also, just on that topic, I saw this morning they've laid off 2,500 people, or made them redundant. The real question is, why are the other 2,500 still there? What are they doing? What are they doing different? Because it's not any different from John Lewis or Marks and Spencer or anybody else. And if you don't do something really different, why are you here?
Yeah, no, I think you only get what. The other thing I'd add to what you're absolutely right, David. I think the other thing I'd add is that you only get one bite at the cherry, from my experience. So you have one shot, and you need to hit it very hard and quite much harder than you should do. So that, yeah, I totally agree. What is left? It can't be viable, and that's why I describe as being more or less of the same, and certainly not new action. So that's certainly not a.
They've had 4 months to put something forward in terms of doing something new. And what have they put forward?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's probably a fair statement. That's an EQ problem as well. So that is
an EQ problem.
And it's probably too late. Well, it's probably not too late. You probably could turn it around, but it needs to move now.
Okay, we have one final question from Nick Brown again. Nick, for you, Paul, and he's thanking you for the other answers you gave him. So, Paul, are you concerned about the UK credit rating?
Really good question. Thanks, Nick. No, I'm not, personally. I'm not a ratings analyst, obviously, but my context and my perception around this is relativity. So when you look at the relative economies and you look at how strong and robust they are, I still think the UK is in a pretty strong position, albeit clearly the whole country's taking on a big loss this year and probably 5 or 10 years worth of debt it wasn't planning for. But that's no different to most of the comparable economies, I would say, from what I can see. Clearly, the question is always going to be around the giant economies that are emerging and how have they weathered the virus more, and will we see business shift more and more towards those areas and accelerate? Who knows? But to answer your question directly, Nick, I'm not particularly concerned about the credit rating of the UK, or indeed if it was downgraded, what that would do. I don't think it fundamentally shift what we see day to day in business.
Lovely, great answer.
Fantastic.
And that's for questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So, David Allen, would you like to just try and wrap up the main points that you've taken away from this, please?
I think the main points that we can take away, Paul, you've given us some great view from a sort of 50,000 foot level, sort of merging down to a 25,000 foot level, interestingly enough, on a bunch of different areas. I think that the main takeaways that you're saying, Paul, is that we really have to have some new now in all phases of these businesses, and we've got to be very, very, very careful. And I think that in terms of wrapping everything up, it's all about the winning thinking. It's all about changing how you think. And as you said, some of these changes, certainly the changes that the bank has had to make, 5 years worth of change in 4 days. I mean, come on. Everybody walked around 4 months ago and said, yeah, the work at home thing, that'd be really kind of a cool thing. Guess what? It's all here. And I think that's one of my favorite phrases now on everything. Guess what? It's all here. So there's no time to change, no time to not change. We've got to do it. So thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it. Thanks to the whole audience. It's a great day.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. It's a great summary. I think I'd just add one thing. I'd like to encourage us all to take new action. So we've got some very interesting people on this call, some very experienced people with a lot of clout, a lot of reach. So I'd like to challenge us all to actually identify opportunities where we can work together, because it's only by working together that we'll actually be able to fix some of these problems. So we offer part of that solution. Paul offers part of that solution. Nick has just been speaking, and Andy has just raised some of the questions. So this is let's take action as a consequence of this call, please. I'd like to encourage us to do that and step over the edge. But Paul, thank you very much. It's great to see you, speak to you, and thank you very much for your frank, straightforward discussion. And I'm sure Barclays would be proud of you.
No, as well, it's very kind of you to have me along. So thank you, guys, and I look forward to joining future sessions. And do take care, and take care on that bike, Tom.
Yeah,
I know you're out on your bike a lot. You take care.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.